For a very long time, there has been an idea out there that Jesus Christ of the Christians was based on the Indo-Aryan god Mithra or Mithras. But where does this idea come from, and is there any truth to it? Let's find out. The earliest known source for this claim was Charles Francis Dupuy in 1794, when he published a massive work titled The Origin of All Religious Worship, in which he claimed that Jesus, like Mithras, was born on the 25th of December of a virgin. He died and rose again. He had 12 disciples, had a Last Supper, etc. And I'm sure most people have heard of the various claims before, because they have been propagated so widely. All the basic claims proposed by Dupuy in 1794 are the exact same ones that are still heard today. The main argument pursued through the book is that Mithras is the sun god, and that Jesus is only one of many iterations of this same mythological explanation of the sun and its various functions, powers, and its birth and rebirth. However, most of the work is pure conjecture and assertion. Writing as an academic on the side of the French Revolution against Christianity, Dupuy played fast and loose with the facts, to put it mildly. In truth, he seems to have completely fabricated most of his claims. There is, for instance, no evidence to support any notion that Mithra was born on the 25th of December, for instance. Dupuy says this only because, in his view, Mithras is the sun, and the sun is reborn on December 25th due to the cycle of the solstices, and therefore so is Mithras. But this is all his own projection. And even though Sol Invictus, the Roman sun god, had a celebration on the 25th of December, it doesn't follow from that this celebration had anything to do with the rebirth of the sun or that it was his birthday. There is nowhere any information in any ancient source that suggests this. Now, it's likely, in my opinion, that rebirth was involved in the cult of Mithras in some way, but to jump from the Sol Invictus celebration day of the 25th of December to the idea that Mithras as a god and Christ as a divine being are identical is simply something postulated by Dupuy and doesn't have a basis in evidence. Furthermore, Mithras was not born of a virgin. The oldest source of information on Mithra, the Persian god, that we have is when he is invoked along with Varuna and Indra to certify or ratify a treaty in about 1500 BC. Close to that time, we have the Rig Vedic hymns to Mithra and Varuna, where Mithra is called the child of Aditi, who is the mother of various other highly regal deities, called the Adityas. There is no surviving evidence that there was any Persian myth about his birth from a virgin. On the contrary, his Roman cult clearly shows him being born from a stone, or sometimes from an altar. Dupuy simply invented this claim. There is likewise no evidence that Mithra or Mithra was ever thought to have had 12 disciples. Again, this is pure conjecture based on him being associated with the path of the zodiac, and in Mithraic temples being shown alongside the zodiac figures. But in no way could these be postulated as being disciples of his. However, we do know that the Romans did closely associate Mithras with the sun, and with some ritual meal and that Christians in the 4th century did complain about certain similarities between the two in terms of the meal. Some claiming, however, not that they were copying Mithraism, but that it was copying them. In my opinion, it is quite likely that the traditions developed entirely independent of each other, from the classical practice of sharing a meal with the gods. In the case of Mithraism, it may have been emblematic of the initial covenant between Mithra and the world. It might even involve the first sacrifice, which is represented by Mithras slaying the bull, and this bull then being the source of all sustenance in the world, born from the first sacrifice. In Vedic tradition, there is a story about the slaying of Soma, and Mithra is very reluctant to engage in this slaying, but eventually he agrees, and Soma is slain, and it's distributed throughout the whole world. And it's thought that this form of Soma is the energy and life force that is within plants. And this is why you see in the depiction of Mithra slaying the bull, there is sometimes not only blood coming out of the bull that's being slain, but corn come out of the bull. So just so we don't have to continue to go through every single item that Dupuy lists where he links Mithras to Jesus, none of the things that he lists actually turn out to have any basis in fact. There are some things, I would say, that might even be suggestive, but there is no evidence to support them. One could only guess at them. Nor does Dupuy ever really present any evidence in his work to back up his claims. He simply states it as true. So even if we have some sympathy and some reason to believe that Christ was in some way representative of a solar figure, there is no evidence to directly link him to Mithra. While it's true that Mithra is now effectively a sun god in Zoroastrianism, with the Persian word for the sun being derived from his name, this was not true in antiquity, and it was not true during the period when the Avesta hymns to Mithra were written, nor is it true of Mithra from Vedic sources. Though he is linked to the sun and to light in both cases, he is distinct from the sun itself. The name Mithra means that which causes to bind, and in his origin he is a god of contract and covenant. And in the Avesta hymns, this nature can be clearly seen. He strikes down those who violate their oaths. He destroys the nations who lie unto him. He kills the warriors who have not upheld their contracts. But he brings blessings and protection and even eternal bliss to those who do. He stands sleeplessly, observing everything in the world, and he precedes the tireless horses of the sun and takes his place atop the mountains overlooking the wide pastures. And in this, he is clearly linked to the light and the movement of the sun, and is seen almost as bringing the sun. But he is not the sun. He relates to it in that the sun sees all things, and that contracts and oaths are made in the light of day beneath the sun. But his metaphysical existence expands far beyond the physical object of burning fire drawn through the sky. His later equation with the sun seems to stem from similarities between the solar function and his own function, and how they overlap. Even in the early Vedic tradition, he has a close association with light and the sun. But when this more esoteric understanding of the god devolves in the later period, he simply becomes the sun god, taking over the roles that were ascribed to the sun separately in earlier traditions. We see even in the Roman cult, which was not necessarily closely related to the Persian religion, but was somewhat uniquely Roman, although clearly inspired by the god Mithra. Mithra is often equated with Sol, the sun god. However, even though he is called often Mithras Sol Invictus, he is featured separately in many Mithraic artworks. So he will be featured together with the sun, reclining together with Sol, or standing with Sol, or with Sol hovering overhead. But he is shown to be not Sol. Mithra was the original god of contract and covenant, and he was concerned with social organization, truth, justice, and he confers the right to rule upon kings, for that is likewise the highest contract, and he removes that right from kings who violate their contract. This is detailed in the Yast dedicated to him. So what, if any, connection, then, does Jesus have to Mithra? There is an argument that has Christ as a type of covenant between God and man. His death effectively acts as the creation of this new covenant, formed at the Last Supper. After all, it is called the New Testament, meaning someone's legacy or will, primarily after death. He is thus the mediator of a new contract between men and God. The crucifixion was said by some to be the required blood of the covenant. The drinking of the wine as the blood of Christ is also part of this same practice of renewing the covenant between oneself and God through the medium of Christ. Thus Jesus said, "This cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood." This is the entire basis of communion, the most holy sacrament in Christianity. And it was this communion which, according to ancient Christians, is what was similar to the cult of Mithras. But it has nothing specific to do with the sun, but with the covenant between men and God, and the forgiveness of sin through it. One of the most called upon functions of Mitra Varuna is that same thing, the forgiveness of sin. The gods who uphold cosmic and moral law and bind men can also liberate them from the negative consequences for those violations. Sometimes those punishments were harsh, and we see examples in the Mithra Yast and hymns to Mitra Varuna that demonstrate this fear, this terror of the deadly consequences of violating the ordinances of these gods, because they were thought not only the covenants that bind men together, but the covenant that binds the entire universe together, that orders the entire cosmos, that sets everything in the universe into its proper motion. To go against that cosmic ordering is sin, and this is what is punished, and this is what is feared. But through the practice of the sacrament of communion, it is thought in the Christian tradition that one can liberate themselves from this sin through renewing their pact with God. Some pagans criticize this practice as being immoral, because in their view encouraged people to be able to do whatever they wanted to do, and then to absolve themselves of that wrongdoing through simply engaging in this meal. But nevertheless, we do see similar examples of this same kind of thing in hymns dedicated to Mitra Varuna, where they are pleaded to forgive people of their sins, and sacrifices are made to them to this effect. So the idea of Christ as the creator and sustainer of the covenant between man and God, with communion acting as the renewal of that bond through the blood of Christ, does seem to have some relation to the actual identity of Mithra as the god of covenant. That some of the symbology surrounding Christ is solar or astrological in origin may be true, but his primary cosmic role would not be the literal sun, though the sun, because of its luminous qualities and its role in the world, is thought to be closely connected to him. And thus in Irish, the Christian god is said to be Rí na Gréine, king of the sun. And Saint Adamnan describes his experience of seeing God as a blazing fire that was many times brighter than the sun. So even though Dupuy made up most of his facts, there does seem to be some kind of connection, though I don't think it is a conscious one, and I don't think it was entirely a copy. And we see this connection probably hinted at with the idea of the three magi coming to visit Christ at his birth. His role of establishing the new covenant is a role that is played by a god of the covenant. And in this way, he specifically does relate to Mithra. But in my opinion, it is not that Christ copies Mithras, but simply the important role of this function in the cosmological conception. And likewise, the Mithras cult that shows the slaying of the bull likely meant to represent the first sacrifice and the establishment of the covenant, the creation of food and life in the world, does in some way connect to the idea of Christ as being the blood and the wine that one drinks and consumes during communion, as the reestablishment of this covenant. But of course, in that case, the sacrifice is not Christ, it is the bull. And that reinforces the pagan tradition of the sacrifice of the animal as representing or recreating the first original sacrifice that was made, the reestablishment of the covenant between men and gods. In the new covenant of Christianity, Christ replaces the sacrifice with himself, effectively. The old covenant between God and man in the Hebrew tradition was this strict set of laws that had to be maintained. But the new covenant established by Christ was that human beings had to change themselves from within, had to change their attitude and their hearts, and to do things from out of goodness, not through adherence to a set of laws. One had to elevate themselves into being holy rather than simply obeying doctrine. So it's a transformative process rather than one that's simply formulaic. But through Christ, through the covenant established by Christ, one could be forgiven of wrongdoing, of sin, of mistakes that they have made. And likewise, this seems to have been the role ascribed primarily to Mithra in the combination of Mithra Varuna in the Vedic tradition. So that Mithra was the intermediary between men and gods, and between each men and other men in terms of their legal contracts. And this is why Mithra becomes known as friend, because he establishes the bonds between people that make them become friends. And likewise, he could absolve one of the punishments dealt out by Varuna, because he was the governor of that covenant. And this does seem to be the role, or a role, of Christ in the Christian tradition. But I know that Christians listening to me right now probably are pulling their hair out. But this is simply an interpretation standing outside of Christian dogma, looking in and analyzing it with comparative analysis. It's not meant to offend Christians or their traditions. But I do hope that you liked the video, and if you did, you'll like, subscribe, and please leave your comments below. And as always, stand tall.